Valuing public goods, the purchase of moral satisfaction. Hello and welcome to our presentation on valuing public goods, the purchase of moral satisfaction. This research paper was published in 1992 by two esteemed economists, Daniel Kahneman and Jack Knetsch. Daniel Kahneman is celebrated as one of the forefathers in behavioral economics for his paper, Prospect Theory. Jack Knetsch is celebrated for combining the ideals of behavioral economics with the practices of environmental economics, specifically his investigation into cost-benefit analysis. The topic of today's paper is an investigation into perhaps the most serious shortcomings of contingent value method, and we will answer the question of whether contingent value method is indeed an accurate way of determining a person's willingness to pay. Governments, statisticians, and economists alike all share the need to accurately determine an individual's willingness to pay. For that reason, the contingent valuation method has become widely used to determine respondents' willingness to pay. The method works by asking respondents to indicate their value for a public good, usually by having them specify the maximum amount they would be willing to pay to retain or obtain the use of the good. Contingent valuation has been largely adopted due to its capability of directly measuring a broad range of economic benefits for a wide range of goods. Importantly, it is able to measure the value of non-market goods whose benefits may not be measured under traditional economic frameworks. Secondly, it has important use in determining the magnitude of damages to litigation victims. Thirdly, it has implications in cost-benefits assessments when it is used as the means in determining an individual's willingness to pay. This affects determining the total value of different projects. The contingent valuation method relies on the assumption that the willingness to pay for a good is a measure of the economic value associated with that good. However, is that truly the case? The research paper finds two unwanted effects in willingness to pay responses. The first is the order effect. The order effect found that when the value of several goods are ordered in succession, the same good elicits a higher willingness to pay if it is first in the list rather than if it is valued after others. A thought experiment to showcase the order effect is that in the absence of opportunities for storage, resale, or altruistic giving, most adults will have a zero willingness to pay for a large ice cream cone immediately after consumption of the first large ice cream cone. This is important for a contingent valuation method because the order in which goods are mentioned in a survey is purely arbitrary. Any effect of this variable raises questions about the validity of the responses. Secondly, we have the embedding effect. The embedding effect shows that the willingness to pay for a good is highest when the good is evaluated on its own as opposed to its inferred willingness to pay from a more inclusive good valuation. A thought experiment to showcase the embedding effect is that the sum an individual will pay to avoid the loss of both an arm and a leg is likely to be much less than the sum of the willingness to pay to save each limb separately. The contingent valuation method results infer total valuation by multiplying the average willingness to pay by the number of households in the relevant population. However, this can be very troublesome. The paper covers a study in which the willingness to pay of Toronto residents for increased taxes to prevent the drop in fish populations in all of Ontario lakes was only slightly higher than the willingness to pay to preserve the fish stocks in only a small area of Ontario. Does the value of saving some fish in Muskoka really equal the value of saving a greater number of fish in all of the lakes in Ontario? This example prompts one of the main investigative findings of the paper. That is, we need to define the proper level of aggregation for the evaluation of a specific good.
Continuing on the topic of embedding. The first study, highlighted in the paper, illustrates the effect that embedding has on a public good that also had personal relevance to the respondents. Due to the fact that the public good was symbolic in a way, the willingness to pay of the good was hardly affected by the inclusiveness of it, and that embedding not only happens in existence value, but also in symbolic one. Alright, on to the study. The study took place in the Vancouver region right after the San Francisco earthquake of 1989, enhancing the relevance of the topic to the participants. There were 3 survey groups that were asked 3 different lines of questioning. The first group was asked about their willingness to pay each year through higher taxes or user fees for a special fund that was to improve environmental services. Then, respondents were asked the total amount they would allocate to the preparedness of the disasters. Lastly, they were asked what part allocated in improving preparedness should go to the availability of equipment and trained personnel. Then, the second group wasn't asked about an initial amount to improve environmental services, just the later 2, and the third group was only asked the last question, regarding allocating specifically towards equipment and trained personnel. The results of the study demonstrate a large embedding effect, which is shown on the next slide. Table 1 here shows the mean and median amounts of the money the respondents were willing to pay for the different classes of good that they were asked about. It shows that Group 1 differs significantly from Group 2 and 3 by both parametric and non-parametric tests, especially evident in the last question. The median amounts allocated to equipment and trained personnel vary from $25 when that good is evaluated on its own to $1.50 when the initial questioning concerns willingness to pay for environmental services, or i.e. Group 1. This shows a wide variation of data and supports the hypothesis that the test results demonstrate a large embedding effect. It is further examined when analyzing the data more closely, as the estimate of the willingness to pay for the same good differ by a factor of 16 for medians and 8 for means, depending on the scope of the initial question. As with most studies, there were 2 issues that were highlighted in the paper. Firstly, the data included some extremely high responses, up to 25% of households' income, which could have reflected misunderstandings of instructions by the respondents. These responses have considerably affected the means of the willingness to pay, but there's no agreed way to draw a line beyond which responses will be rejected and which will not. Secondly, respondents who stated 0 response to the initial question were assigned 0 responses to subsequent allocation questions. This could bias the results because of the theoretical possibility that a respondent might be willing to pay for the good but not for a bundle that includes it. This can be limited by informing respondents in advance that they will have an opportunity to allocate each contribution to an inclusive good among its separate subjects. To further see how embedding affects willingness to pay results, the researchers wanted to see how distant the respondents viewed payment schedules that differed greatly in total present value of their willingness to pay. Therefore, the respondents were asked another question based on if they had to pay using a one-time payment or every year for a period of 5 years. The results showed that the median willingness to pay for both was $20, so there was no reliable indication that respondents discriminated between payment schedules that varied in total present value. From the studies illustrated above, some importance of embedding was concluded when calculating willingness to pay of a good. Firstly, the contingent valuation of any public good should routinely be supported by acceptable evidence that the estimate is potent enough against any use of embedding. This means that future applications of the contingent value should incorporate an experimental control. Secondly, observations that have different embeddings lead to different valuations of the same good. This would not be as touching if there were a way of selecting one of these valuations as the correct one. There are, however, no compelling principles that help shape the appropriate embedding level for a good to be evaluated or duration of payment. So, the designer of a contingent valuation survey may be able to determine the estimated value of any good by the choice of a level of embedding. This potential for manipulation severely undermines the contingent valuation method and shows the importance of why the large factor of embedding needs to be minimized when conducting surveys.
Results up until this point suggest that willingness to pay for a public good is not a sufficient measure of economic value of the good. However, when respondents express a willingness to contribute to a public good, there's no reason to doubt their sincerity. With this stream of thought, economists began thinking of the responses of a contingent valuation question as a means of expressing the willingness to acquire a sense of moral satisfaction, and this often comes by means of voluntary contributions to the provision of a public good. Now, what is moral satisfaction? Well, moral satisfaction is kind of that warm feeling you get when you donate to a charity, and it's kind of an unusual good, and it's definitely unlike any sort of traditional consumption good. It increases with the size of contribution, and the expenditure is actually that essential aspect of consumption. So you start feeling that utility as soon as you actually make that expenditure to the charitable cause. Additionally, public goods provide differing degrees of moral satisfaction to each individual. So my moral satisfaction for a charity donation will be different than every one of yours. And this comes down to reflect individual tastes and community values. Further, studies have shown that moral satisfaction exhibits an embedding effect, where the moral satisfaction between an individual cause and a subset of causes have minor differences. We'll kind of explore this more in an experiment where 14 pairs of public goods were constructed. Each pair consists of two causes, and one of which was embedded in the other. So to explain this a little further, let's draw our eyes to the first pair on this list. As you can see, we're comparing the cause of reducing acid rain in the Muskokas to a similar cause in Eastern Canada. And with this pair, we can see that the Muskoka is being embedded within the Eastern Canada cause. So now that we've kind of had an idea what the study is trying to achieve, and we're kind of trying to measure the embedding effect, we've realized that there's kind of a really small differential between the basketed good and the standalones. While the baskets tend to produce a slightly higher moral satisfaction, as you can see on this list here, the results were not material enough to warrant further attention. As such, we can say that the presence of the embedding effect is quite minor in the case of moral satisfaction, effectively minimizing the impact of the embedding effect when producing contingent valuation analysis. As a result of this minimization of the embedding effect, the study found a very strong correlation of 0.78 between the means of satisfaction ratings and the median willingness to pay for both causes. What does this mean? Well, this strongly supports the notion that the willingness to pay can be predicted by the moral satisfaction. So instead of using that dollar value that people say in their surveys, we can use this moral satisfaction as a proxy for the actual willingness to pay. And this strongly pushes the notion that this willingness to pay for public goods, that should be an expression of the willingness to acquire that moral satisfaction. So the final part of the study aims to understand the decisions of the respondents of the contingent valuation survey. And to do so, we also need to identify where people draw their contributions towards public goods out of their own personal budgets. So do they draw it from entertainment, or more importantly, do they kind of reallocate their budgets for their existing charitable donations and spend accordingly? This would result in drawbacks in other spending towards charitable donations, and I think the researchers from this study think that's not the best cause. Through a quick study by a question at the end of each CV survey from the previous study, it was determined that individuals would draw their additional spending towards the public goods out of their entertainment budgets, as you can see from the graph below. This often seldom reduced their charitable donations towards other sources, which is a great outcome nonetheless. Now moving on to some questions. The first one being, are contingent valuation services a sufficient measure in determining the willingness to pay for public goods? And how can this measure be improved? As we know, the contingent valuation comes with its set of opposers, and most of these opposers are likely upset about the sources of error with the contingent valuation analysis, namely the hypothetical bias, free riding, strategic bias, and embedding bias. Although this study aims to improve that embedding bias through the reassessment of willingness to pay through moral satisfaction, and while this is in the right direction, there still is the question of, is the method strong enough for use in economic and environmental decision making? As of right now, it is the only available means for estimating the existing value component of non-market benefit, and the method is very widely used because of that. It is important to answer this question, as the continued strengthening of this model only comes with stronger environmental and economic decisions and more precise analyses. So how do you think that we can improve this method to only improve our decision making?
Alright, on to our second question. To remind everyone, the embedding effect is when the same good is assigned a lower value of willingness to pay, when that willingness to pay for it is inferred from a more inclusive good, rather than if the particular good is evaluated on its own. As shown by the first study, respondents were willing to pay a difference of just under $25 for the equipment and trained personnel when that was all they were asked about, compared to when it was the second or third environmental issue they had to allocate money towards. Therefore, it is evident any designer of a contingent valuation survey may be able to determine the estimated value of any good by their choice of level of embedding they want, as there are no principles or policies in place against it. So, my question is, what policies should be put in place to effectively value a good without the ability of embedding to manipulate the results of the participant's willingness to pay? Who would be affected if these designers skew results in their favor?